Good. So yeah, lovely to see everyone on screen, off screen, and to, in a way, follow on from Akasha Raja's introduction last week to this new series of Sangha. We have this new theme, which is trying to explore the vision of the Buddhist Center. The Buddhist Center has a vision. It's a vision that has 4 parts to it. And we're trying to explore these 4 different themes using the talks of Sangharakshita, our founder Sangharakshita. The original talks are generous in length. In those pre-ADD days, he used to regularly talk for about an hour and a half. And we're going to try and summarize them a little bit. So we're going to represent them, summarize them, maybe bring them a bit up to date. And so I'll just outline again very quickly the 4 themes which constitute the vision of the Buddhist Center. So the first of them is awakening. So the Buddhist Center is here to help us move towards awakening. So that's quite a big brief, really. And I think it's important to remember this. This is basically what we're about. It's not an adult education organization, it's not a community center, or it's not just either of those. Basically what we're about is moving towards awakening. So that's the first one. The second one is Sangha. So it is about community, it is about spiritual community, and it's fostering spiritual community, spiritual friendship between us, because that's such an important condition for awakening. This is part of Sangharakshita's insight, really, that spiritual community is so important for awakening. And we'll touch on that a little bit in this talk. Thirdly, there's altruism, the theme of altruism. So the Buddhist Center is here to support your altruistic activity. It's here to support all manner of different kinds of altruistic activity. And this is an aspect of the Bodhisattva ideal, an aspect of the altruistic aspect of awakening. And finally, there's a theme that has been called passing it on. So this is about lineage. This is about how it's all very well us getting on and improving our life, thanks to the Buddha's teachings. But the only reason we have the Buddha's teachings are because there's been this unbroken lineage from 25 centuries ago leading up to us. And it's our responsibility to pass that on to the next generation. So the way that happens is many and various. It may be by, the first thing is we have to understand, assimilate, internalize, realize the Buddha's teachings to whatever extent we can, and communicate that, which may be informally through friendship, through being around each other, and maybe formally by sitting up front here and giving talks, but that needs to carry on. And there's some of us who are more equipped in age terms to do that than others. But it's really important that somehow or other this whole process keeps on going. So each week we'll be exploring one of these 4 themes, and tonight I'm exploring the awakening theme. We'll be doing each one of these themes 3 times, so we're kind of circulating around them. So there's going to be 3 talks on awakening, taking 3 of Sangharakshita's kind of most blistering talks, I think. So Vajradevi is going to be talking on breaking through to Buddhahood, and Jyotidhana is talking on a taste of freedom. And tonight I'm talking about enlightenment as experience and non-experience, which sounds a bit mysterious, doesn't it? So last week, Akasha Raja talked of awakening. He talked of awakening as a process, which is very much the way that Sangharakshita is talking about enlightenment actually in this talk. So in one sense, we just get on with our life, don't we? We do the next thing. We engage in the process of growth, the process of practice. But it's very good occasionally to kind of be, to take our gaze from right in front of us and up to where we're heading. And I think that's what these talks will give us. They'll give us a bit of a sense of where we're heading, what is this end point of awakening that we're heading for. So just to give a quick intro to the talk, Sangharakshita gave this talk in 1975, which is kind of getting towards the end of the hippie era, if you like, which I think is significant. I think we can say that in that period there was a lot of interest in experience, intense experience, possibly drug-fueled experience. And Sangharakshita seems to have thought that it's important to say something about this. He's addressing a kind of over-evaluation of experience. I think we can infer that from the talk. He actually gave this talk to the Buddhist Society with Christmas Humphreys in the chair. And the whole question that he raises is, well, what is enlightenment? Is it an experience? If it's not an experience, then what is it? Is it non-experience? What on earth can he mean by that? So let's start off with a little quote. A little quote from Sangharakshita. Sorry for those of you in the room, you're going to have to look at my desktop. I thought it'd be nice to actually play some of what Sangharakshita said. So these are little clips from the talk itself.
Thought itself is an experience. Now, if we want to speak just very generally, basically, with regards to what experience is, we may say that experience is outstandingly a matter of perception and feeling. Experience means the actual living through an event. Not just looking at it, not just contemplating it, not just thinking about it, but actually living through that event, experiencing it, as we say. Experience also suggests real life as contrasted with the ideal or the imaginary life or existence. So enlightenment as experience means, therefore, enlightenment as something which we actually perceive, which we actually feel, felt in the nerves and felt along the heart, felt in the blood, felt in the bones, not just something abstractly thought about or speculated about or imagined or fantasized about, and something that we live through. Enlightenment as experience is something that we live through. But when, of course, we experience enlightenment, we live through enlightenment in a rather different way from the way in which we live through any other experience. In the case of other experiences, we, as it were, come out at the other end, intact or modified to some extent. But in the case of the experience of enlightenment, we do not come out at the other end. There is no end. Maybe there's an end of us, but that is another matter. We do not come out at the other end. So that we may say, enlightenment is something which is, as it were, a continuing part of our life after we've experienced it. Or rather, our life becomes a continuing part of enlightenment itself.
So he's talking about how the difference between a conventional experience is we come out of the other end of it, but with enlightenment there is, as it were, no end to it. I'm going to come back to this at the end because it sounds a bit mysterious, doesn't it? Okay, so this is what experience is. It's experience in contradistinction to rational thinking, if you like, and to ideas about or fantasies about. And that sounds really, really attractive, doesn't it? We want direct experience. We want to live through in a full-blooded kind of way. So why do we think of enlightenment as being an experience? It seems kind of self-obvious, really, doesn't it? What else could it be? We don't have any other category. If it's not experience, what is it? I think, and what he brings out is that this is quite a contemporary perspective. It's quite a temporary obsession almost, the obsession with experience, with peak experience. And one thing which I'll just read, actually, this isn't in Sangharakshita's talk, this was given in a talk by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's, if you like, the founder of secular mindfulness. This is something he gave or wrote in 2011. He says, "We are never appealing to authority or tradition, only to the richness and of the present moment, held gently in awareness, and the profound and authentic authority of each person's own experience." The profound and authentic authority of each person's personal experience. So that sounds really appealing, doesn't it? No appeal to authority, the only authority is our authentic personal experience. And this is very much part of the zeitgeist that we're in. And it's not really the zeitgeist that the Buddha was in. I think it's worth saying that. There's a lot that could be dismantled about what Jon Kabat-Zinn said. But I think it's important to recognize this is kind of where we're coming from. Sangharakshita says, in the original scriptures, there isn't really any word for experience. You couldn't retranslate back into Pali, enlightenment is an experience. So it just puts a whole question mark over the whole kind of framework, the whole context that we have of thinking about enlightenment. So then the question comes, why have we arrived at this point of thinking in terms of experience, of valuing experience so highly? And he gives quite a long, interesting, detailed analysis of that. He goes right back, pre-Reformation, to work out the trajectory that has landed us here. I'm not going to try and recapitulate that. If you want to hear that, you'll have to listen to the talk. But I think that what's significant is that we are here, and it's important to realize that we're here. And in doing so, in valuing personal experience, a few things have tended to get left behind. And he gives a few examples. He says that the whole area of myth, legend, the imagination has been left behind. Because we value direct experience, what's really happening now. It's real, that's real, and all this other stuff we sort of dismiss as being unreal. The collective social institutions of religion, in this case of Buddhism. Collective religion has got a bit of a bad press, hasn't it? So that's something else that tends to have been downplayed, and ritual has tended to be downplayed. And the emphasis on experience seems to come in the contemporary time that he was talking, and even more so, I think, now, because our life feels so alienated. We're kind of alienated by busyness, by complexity, especially now by lots of little two-dimensional screens in front of us, little phones. It's kind of quite alienating from the raw basic experience of feeling connected to the people around us, the world around us, the environment, our natural environment. And that leaves us feeling a bit dull, a bit alienated, and therefore we turn towards experience for compensation. We turn towards compensatory experience. So let's see if I can play this a little bit. See what happens now.
So the way in which we regard life is rather ambivalent. On the one hand, we find life, we feel life oppressive, burdensome, frustrating, stultifying. But on the other, we expect from life something that will alleviate that frustration. Expect something compensatory. Expect an experience, in the modern sense of this term.
Okay, so we may or may not agree with that analysis. This is where he's coming from. He's saying that we are looking for experience. We're looking, and if we're Buddhist, we're probably looking for religious experience to compensate for the kind of sense of alienation, sense of dullness that may be experienced in the rest of our life. That being the case, what is the significance of that? Well, we tend to have a particular relationship to experience which is not healthy. So again, I'll give you a little quote from him. This will be the last of the quotes.
At this point, I'd like to make a rather important distinction. A distinction between what I call attainment and what I'd like to call acquisition. Attainment is the result of the gradual extension of our own real being and consciousness, an extension into higher levels and new dimensions. And this, in a sense, is a natural process. But acquisition is quite different. Acquisition I would define as the attempted appropriation of the higher level, of the new dimension, by and for ourselves as we at present are. And this is an unnatural and an unrealistic, because eventually unsuccessful, process. It can't possibly succeed in the long run. Attainment is like the growth, like the gradual unfoldment and flowering of a healthy plant. Eventually, the flower is produced, it comes forth upon the branch. But acquisition is like a plant that has stopped growing. So what do? Because the plant has stopped growing, we tie a flower onto it. A flower that has been stolen from somebody else's garden, from some other plant. Or perhaps it's even a wax or a paper flower that we tie on. So the neurotic craving for higher spiritual experience, and I stress the neurotic craving, not the deep, genuine aspiration, the neurotic craving for higher spiritual experience is a form of acquisition. It's an attempt to tie onto the barren branches of our own lives somebody else's flower, even the Buddha's own golden flower, the flower of enlightenment. Attainment is just a matter of growing. Acquisition is a matter of grabbing. It's a sort of smash and grab raid conducted on the absolute. But sometimes things are even worse than that. Sometimes people don't even grab. After all, there's a sort of spirit in grabbing, there's a sort of boldness. You can't help grudgingly admiring the bank robber, for instance, in your weaker moments. But sometimes it's worse than grabbing. Sometimes people don't grab even, they just expect. They lie back with their mouths, as it were, wide open. They adopt a completely passive attitude. They look upon the experience as something that has to be given to them, that has to be fed to them, something for which they don't have themselves to do anything at all.
So I'll leave it there. He does go on to acknowledge he's exaggerating for the sake of effect. But there's something in there, isn't there, that if we're looking towards experience with a kind of neurotic attitude of wanting to grab it, then that's turning it into a kind of an object rather than something that we become, something that we transform ourselves into. And I think what he's bringing out there is the vigor required of spiritual practice. It's he's taking a pop at a passive relationship to spiritual life. We kind of expect to be delivered some sort of experience. So, in fact, I'll just add on a little something here. That this is more of a contemporary observation. I was just wondering if there's a danger of this passive attitude that comes from overuse of guided meditation that we can get on whatever, Headspace or Insight Timer or all the rest of it. One can quite happily go through one's entire meditation career listening to one or other of famous people guiding you on in meditation. And guided meditations are fantastic for pointing us in roughly the right direction, for sort of building up a practice and for learning what that practice is about. But if we don't ever go freestyle, so to speak, if we always follow guided meditations, then we're never actually going to discover how to work creatively with our own mind. And we're never going to discover the depths of our own mind. We're just going to be following the railway tracks laid down by someone else. So that's just a thought I had in relationship to this sort of, what he talks about as this passive attitude to experience. So what are the consequences? What are the consequences of treating enlightenment as experience and then having either an acquisitive attitude or even a passive attitude towards it? So he says we will have one of three attitudes. He thinks we will look for this experience from somewhere else, from someone else, or from something else. And he invents three wonderful new words to describe each of these, which I wish I could impersonate with the full marvellous Sangharakshita. But anyway, the first one, if we think of it as coming from somewhere else, then we will experience the syndrome, as he calls it, of zeudo spiritual exoticism. Zeudo spiritual exoticism. So this is where we think that this experience, this big experience, is going to be delivered from somewhere really exotic. The further away, the better. So the fact you've walked into little old Shrewsbury Triratna Buddhist Centre suggests you're not too much under the thrall of this. You're not going out to the Far East or wherever. But it might be worthwhile thinking, is there any part of me that thinks, well, it's okay here, but I mean, if it was in Thailand or if it was in Tibet, even better, or if it was in the Far East, that'd be the real deal. In Shrewsbury, it's handy, but it can't be the real deal because it doesn't have all the colour and all the funny hats and all the rest of it. So that's zeudo spiritual exoticism, and we're looking for something really kind of exotic in our Dharma practice. If we think this experience will be delivered by someone else, then we will fall into the trap of zeudo spiritual projection. So this is where we think that some guru will do it for us. They will sort of say just the right words. They will have the pointing out instruction that will blow our head open, or they'll point to us and the transmission will happen, or You'll find just the right guru who knows exactly what you need to do and can guide you every step of the way. That's one little fantasy I have. If only I could find the person who knew exactly what I needed to do, then it would be easy. So that's zeudo spiritual projection. And finally, if you think it's going to come from something else, this is zeudo spiritual technism. I think you just made that word up, technism, but there we go. So this is where you place an exaggerated importance on a particular technique. Maybe it's a particular meditation technique. It could be a particular text even. And I was just hearing from someone who's, there's someone coming to the Sangha, and they say there's only one sutra. There's only one sutra that you need to study, and this is the sutra you need to be studying. And of course it's true that in a sense, if we really mine one sutra or one meditation technique, that'll do it for us. But if we think this is the one true and only way, then we can discount other techniques and think other people aren't doing it right. Or we might be on this sort of endless hunt for just the right practice for me, just the right teaching for me. All these other ones aren't working. And Sangharakshita reminds us that there's a whole great range of different meditation practices, and they've all been tried and tested in the Buddhist tradition over centuries. So we don't have to think there's just one which will magically unlock. So those are the three syndromes that he came up with. Zeudo spiritual exoticism, zeudo spiritual projection, and zeudo spiritual technicism. So then he turns his mind to enlightenment as non-experience. And he does, as he quite often does, he takes us into the stratosphere briefly. He talks about the bliss of nirvana. So the bliss of nirvana is not dependent on experience. It's not dependent on any particular sense contact. So experience is probably all we can imagine is contact at the physical senses or contact in the mind sense. So it's something that we live through. We have this contact, and then it changes, and then it changes, and then it changes. So he is saying that the bliss of nirvana is not dependent on contact. It is independent of contact. That's why it's called the unconditioned. It is unconditioned. So to my mind, one way of thinking about this is it's more about the relationship to contact, as it were. That's what makes it nirvanic. We're kind of independent of the contacts, of the experiences, because our relationship is not one of greed, hatred, or delusion. So that opens up this huge space of freedom. And then what he does, which is what he often does, is he brings it right crashing down to earth. He says, there's three ways we can think about this. And this is where he's in a way not so much talking about the end point, he's talking about enlightening, he's talking about awakening, the process. He says we can think about the process in three ways. We can think about it as growth, we can think about it as work, and think about it as duty. So those probably aren't quite as exotic, are they? But there we go. Growth, work, and duty. So I'll just rattle through them quickly. So in terms of growth, this is a way that he very often comes back to talking about the spiritual life. The spiritual life is a path of growth. Sometimes it's talked about as a path. I talked about a path of growth, but sometimes the image of growth is a bit more satisfying because the path is all a bit linear, isn't it? And it's this and then that and then that and then that and then that. Whereas growth, you have this image of sort of multifaceted development. You're sort of growing on all these different areas at once, like a sort of a flower unfolding. And it also brings in if we take the image of plants growing, they need all these different conditions, don't they? It's not just one condition. Plants, to grow, they need sunlight, and they need just the right amount of sunlight, not too much, not too little. And they need water, not too much, not too little. They need the right kind of soil conditions. They need the right kind of nutrients. And this is kind of where he connects back into the richness of the early Buddhist tradition. It's not just about getting spiritual experience. It's not just about ethics. It's not just about doing the right thing. It's got a whole great range of richness there, including the mythical elements of Buddhism, including the collective elements, including ritual and so on. So these are all conditions for growth. These are all conditions that help us grow and develop. So then he talks about work. And this again doesn't sound terribly exotic, but he talks about work as the creative use of our energies. Most of us need our energies to have some creative outlet. Otherwise we just get a bit dull, really. We don't quite know who we are if we're not brought up against challenges. Objective challenges. The great thing about work is we have objective challenges in the world. You know, the world pushes back at us when we work. Other people push back at us. Whatever environment we're in, you know, we're up against something challenging. There's nothing easy about work, is there? So we kind of learn who we are through working, and we have a channel for our energies. And we grow through that. We enlarge ourselves through that. And of course, he says the best form of work is work for the Dharma, work to communicate the Dharma. And some of us are lucky to be able to do that, and others aren't, but hopefully we can all do it to some extent. Just coming to the centre, you know, some of us were here setting up the shrine room early, you know, that's all working for the Dharma. That's really valuable. And finally, he talks about duty, which is probably even less exotic than the other two. So this is where we simply respond to the needs that we find around us, the needs that we see around us. He quotes Goethe. He talks about the meeting the claims of the day. So there's something about this which is meeting the claims of the day. We're kind of getting out of our own way. We're not so self-orientated, not so sort of egocentric. We're just doing what needs to be done, and there's a certain kind of ease that comes with that, at best, at least, doing what needs to be done. We don't have to be constantly referring to what I want. So that's awakening, enlightening in terms of growth, in terms of work, and in terms of duty. Right back down to earth. So I just want to finish off with a kind of summary for myself, really, which is the value of seeing enlightenment, the value of not seeing enlightenment solely in terms of experience. So we're not getting too kind of fixated on me and my experience. That's kind of quite narrowing. And if we do start narrowing down in that way, then either we might discount ourselves because, well, I've not had the big experience, so I can't be very much, or we get a bit overinflated because we think, hey, I've had this fantastic experience, so I must be a ... So it takes us out of that sphere to an extent, not over-fixating on experience. It opens out our perspective on what spiritual life is about, really. It makes it much more interactive, much more relational, about getting out of our own way, about creatively using our energies. It makes us more realistic in relationship to the people around us, in relationship to the teachings we encounter. We're not expecting too much. And I suppose finally, it means we're not, our understanding of enlightenment isn't so partial. It's opening out our perspective on what enlightenment is about. In a way, it's putting a whole great question mark over it. You know, if we can't relate to it in terms of experience, what does that mean? I find that quite exciting myself. Anyway, that's all I want to say in terms of the talk. Do look it up if you're interested. You'll find it on freebuddhistaudio.com. You'll find a few other talks connected to it as well, or 2 other presentations of it.